Absolutely Haunted presents The Murderous Artist's Ghost Part 1, The Beginning. Can you guess what happens when a young woman moves into a luxurious apartment, one that contains a dining room that was reconstructed piece by piece from an old mansion? A room where a murderous artist once lived and committed an awful act upon his own family. The dining room of this apartment contains the carved statues into which he attempted to place the souls of his loved ones. Did it work? We'll find out in the telling of this chilling tale. I had just passed the bar exam and I had been offered a very generous position with an exclusive big city law firm. I was told that the offer included an apartment of my choice, from the many the firm owned. I was completely excited. I expected the apartment to be small and cramped, but with city prices being what they are, free would certainly be welcome. Imagine my shock when I arrived to meet a lady named Donna at the address given to me and found myself standing in front of a set of lobby doors to a new, modern, luxurious building. The place was all glass and steel. The lobby was beautiful, it was luxury and every inch screamed class. Any apartment in this building would be most welcome, but I swallowed hard thinking I had heard her wrong when Donna informed me that I had been lucky as the partners at the firm had decided to offer me the penthouse. As I toured the place, I could hardly contain my excitement. Nothing prepared me for the moment I stepped onto the massive balcony. The sweeping city views were breathtaking. As stunning as they were, my favorite sight was the one from the downstairs bedroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling window, I gazed at the river, a shimmering silver ribbon winding gracefully through the heart of the city. I knew this would be the room I would choose. From this dizzying height, the streets below looked like a miniature world, with tiny cars and people moving like toys. I had to pinch myself. Was this my life? There was one thing I didn't like about the apartment, and it all revolved around the dining room. The room itself was stunning. The walls were covered in rich, inlaid mahogany paneling, craftsmanship you rarely see anymore. I saw somewhere that mahogany is now a threatened species, impossible to source. So how on earth did they acquire enough to cover this massive room and the statues? The statues were 4 life-sized human figures, carved from the same wood as the walls. That was the first unsettling thing about them. They blended in almost too well, their forms nearly disappearing into the background. 2 men and 2 women. There was something deeply wrong about them that made my skin crawl. But why? I couldn't quite put my finger on it, only that they were watching. Waiting, and it was horrifying. I stood back, taking them in. I laughed because just for a moment the thought crossed my mind that they were evil. "Hey, Donna?" I called. "Yes?" she asked as she stepped into view. "What's up?" I rubbed my hands over my arms, suddenly aware of the chill creeping over me. With a half smile and half grimace, I gestured toward the wooden figures. "Can you explain those?" "This room was installed when the building was being constructed specifically for this apartment," she explained. "The building you are standing in is new. However, the room and those figures are over 80 years old. The walls, the parquet floors, and the statues all come from a demolished mansion, carefully reconstructed here. The life-sized figures are representations of the artist, Richard Clark Challam, his wife, his sister, and her husband. The original room in the mansion was built specifically to house them, just as this room was designed to accommodate them here." I had to ask, "Do you think the firm would agree to remove them?" "They are straight up creepy." Donna shook her head no. "Sorry, those are quite expensive." The head of the firm personally oversaw the creation of this apartment. He acquired this room's entire interior including the statues from an architectural salvage company in another state. Everything was carefully shipped here and meticulously reassembled. It took an enormous amount of effort, money, and logistical headaches. So no, I highly doubt they'd agree to remove them. Donna gestured toward the figure of the artist. This guy was quite famous in his time, and after his death, the value of his life's work skyrocketed. She chuckled. "So, is this a deal breaker?" I blinked. "What?" I shook my head. "Of course not," she smiled. "In that case, I'll take my leave." I walked her to the front door, thanking her profusely for helping me settle in. I closed the front door to the penthouse and began surveying my new kingdom. Aside from the dining room, which I would just stay out of as much as I could, I was quite happy. I hesitated at the doorway to the dining room, not sure why I came back in here. My eyes inevitably landed on the wooden figures once more. I walked over to the artist, a shiver crawled up my spine. Shaking my head, I stepped forward, I reached out, my fingers brushing over the smooth, polished surface of Richard Challam's carved, handsome face. "I wish I could know what you were thinking, Mr. Challam?" I murmured aloud. "What led you to create these?" I let my hand drop away. With a final glance, I turned and walked out. I never knew of the eyes that followed me as I left the room. The thought gnawed at me as I grabbed my bag and headed back down the entry hall. The upstairs suite was undeniably nicer, more spacious, more luxurious, but claiming it would mean something far worse. Every late night returning from the office, I'd have to walk past the dining room. Just the idea of passing its door in the dim silence of the apartment sent a chill through me. I was beginning to regret not choosing a different apartment. As much as I loved the elegance of this place, those statues were getting under my skin far more than they should. It was ridiculous, I knew that. They were just wood-carved figures, nothing more. No different from the millions displayed in museums around the world. Maybe that was the problem. Statues belonged in museums, not in someone's dining room. And the way they blended so seamlessly into the dark wood. I was incredibly busy at work. I would have just enough time to grab a quick bite somewhere, take a shower, and then head to bed. So when I came home one night to find my bed covers all askew, as if someone had been lying in my bed while I was gone, it worried me a lot. I didn't think I had left it that way. Maybe I just forgot since a million things were going through my head before work. I checked the rest of the place and nothing looked out of order. That sealed my thoughts and put my mind at ease. It was a beautiful place, but it was simply not right. I would put something down before turning in for the night, and later I would find it somewhere else entirely, and oftentimes it would be the dining room. For example, my purse, which I never took any farther into the apartment than the entry hall table, would come up missing. Where would I find it? The dining room sideboard. A glass I drank from and put in the kitchen sink would be weirdly enough laying on its side, its contents spilled all over the beautiful parquet floor. I couldn't explain it. I got sick. It started as a chest infection, just a cough, a fever. But it clung to me like something alive, dragging me down until I was trapped in bed for 4 solid days, 2 of them spent flat on my back, drenched in fever sweat. The world outside my bedroom blurred into nothingness. The first time I saw him was during one of those nights. Burning up, throat raw, I forced myself out of bed in the middle of the night, desperate for water. The apartment was silent, thick with the kind of stillness that felt wrong. I shuffled toward the kitchen, the cold floor against my bare feet sending shivers up my fevered body. As I neared the dining room, dread curled in my stomach. My mind whispered dark possibilities. What if they're walking around in there? What if they're waiting? I clenched my jaw. Stop it. This was ridiculous. My fear was spiraling out of control. I forced myself forward, refusing to even glance toward the dining room as I passed. Then I saw it, movement. Not in the dining room but in the kitchen. I froze. The apartment was pitch dark. I hadn't turned on any lights, but something was in there. Someone. Heart hammering, I pressed myself against the doorway, barely breathing as I peeked inside. A man. He stood by the kitchen island, his form nothing more than a tall, shifting shadow. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched him reach out, fingers closing around something on the countertop. The moonlight through the window caught the edge of it for just a second. Metal. One of my knives. I didn't stop to think or try to rationalize. I spun on my heels and ran, forcing my fever-ridden body to move as fast and as quietly as possible. I barely made it to my room before shoving the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. I scrambled for my phone, fingers numb and slick with sweat. The screen glowed as I punched in the numbers, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The apartment remained deathly still. But I knew I wasn't alone. I called the police. When they arrived, I realized something unsettling. I had to unlock 3 locks on my front door to let them in. He had to be inside still. The officers swept through the penthouse, checking every room. And yet, nothing. No signs of forced entry. No open windows. No one. One of them glanced toward the dining room and chuckled. If I had those things staring at me every night, I'd probably start seeing people, too. I forced a laugh, but inside, I felt cold. I knew what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't fevered imagination. There had been a presence standing in my kitchen. I saw him move when he picked up the knife. So how was he gone? The next night found me so sick, I was too weak to leave my bed. The fever had drained every ounce of my strength, leaving me trapped, relying on the care package a friend had left outside my door. Even if I could have walked to the kitchen, I didn't want to. Not after what I had seen. Not after the man. What if he was there again? Maybe it had been the fever twisting my senses, but what if it wasn't? What if I stepped out into that dark, empty penthouse and found him waiting? Fear gnawed at me, mixing with fever dreams until I no longer knew what was real. Sometime late in the night, I woke suddenly. The room was dim, the city lights casting a soft glow through the enormous window. Something was off. I wasn't alone. A shape stood near the window, motionless, gazing down at the city below. He was there and not there all at once, the edges of his transparent form flickering like a shadow caught in candlelight. I held my breath, my fevered mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, he spoke. "I know I am here," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. He didn't turn to face me. "I have been watching you." He sighed. "I have watched you sleeping many nights now." I wanted to scream, to move, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. "I want you to agree to join us, Marielle," he continued. And then he did turn, stepping toward my bed with slow, deliberate movements. A cool touch brushed against my forehead. Was it real? Or just another fevered delusion? His voice softened. "I knew you were right for me when you touched my face for the first time." I wanted to scream, to tell him no, but darkness swallowed me whole before I could say a word. When I awoke, early morning sunlight streamed through the window. I was sure my fever had broken. The room was empty. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Or had he really been here? At first, I brushed it off as a fever-induced hallucination. That was the only logical explanation. I told myself this repeatedly, convincing myself that my mind had played tricks on me. And I believed it. I got up to make some coffee, hesitated at my door, then I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of as I stepped out. I thought to myself that I was just being silly. I would go to the kitchen, grab something to eat, get some much-deserved coffee, and then go back to bed, but as I moved through the penthouse, something felt different. I looked around me, but couldn't figure out what it could be. Then I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My whole body went rigid. There, in the dim glow of the early morning sun, I saw him. Richard Challam. Not standing stiffly against the dining room wall where he belonged. The translucent figure glided across the hallway and through the dining room door as if retreating to his rightful place. A cold wave of terror crashed over me, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't feverish. I saw it. The certainty of that realization sent me sprinting back down the hallway. I grabbed everything I needed off the table and was out the door. I stayed away for 3 days at a local hotel and didn't return until I had to. "They are so creepy," my friend Shay said. "You know what they remind me of?" I looked at her. "Know what?" I asked. "You know those art installations, the exhibits where they paint the model and camouflage them into the background of whatever is around them? That concept has always scared me," she stated. "But these things..." Shay stopped talking as she ran her hand over the face of one of the female figures. My stomach turned with her words. I felt like I wanted to be sick. "Could you not touch them?" I shuddered. "They are spooky enough without you rubbing your hands all over them." Shay looked at me and laughed. "Girl, you do think you saw these things move. Not all of them, just one of them, one of the males." "I am gonna look him up," she said as she pulled out her phone. "I guess you don't need me to tell you his name. He killed these other 3 people at his mansion in the Hudson River Valley, by poisoning food he had prepared for them. The deed was done in this very room." Shay looked around. I could tell by her face she was disgusted. "He was a very famous and quite wealthy artist. He had some pretty weird beliefs, they all did." I looked at her questioningly. They sound like they were almost like some form of a cult. I felt my heart constrict in my chest. Great. As if things were not bad enough. Shay continued. So in 1949, Challam invited his sister, brother-in-law, and wife to his mansion for what appeared to be an intimate dinner gathering. He insisted on cooking and gave all the staff the night off. What his guests didn't know was that he had poisoned their food. As they succumbed to the poison, Challam set a Wilcox Gay recordio machine to play a pre-recorded incantation. He believed that the ancient incantation would transfer their souls to the statues at the moment of their physical death. The statues would then hold the souls as vessels, allowing their ghosts to leave and move about at will. He thought he could keep the other souls contained with him for eternity. I was looking at her horrified. People in the area did not think he had done it until... She got quiet. Until what? There were a lot of stories about these things, moving on their own, stuff like that. She motioned at the statues. Once people started trying to move into the mansion after it was sold, those stories increased and the tales got more scary. I frowned. What happened? I asked. There are many stories, I'll tell you about a few. Shay gave me a moment to process this before she continued on. A New York business owner was the first to buy the Hudson Valley property. He lived there with his wife and a man who worked as his assistant. They were found a few months after moving in their beds. Someone had attacked them in their sleep and no one survived. Next was a woman with ties to Hollywood royalty. Her residency ended in tragedy. She was discovered drowned in the river that passed at the back of the field, just below the mansion. Servants came and went in quick succession. They were unable to endure the eerie happenings within the house. Many swore they had seen the spirits wandering through the halls, always returning to the statues when they were through carrying out their evil deeds. A cook named Mabel Adams didn't even wait until morning to flee. When her employer finally managed to track her down, she recounted her terrifying experience. She had woke in the middle of the night to the sound of movement coming from the kitchen. Sleepy but curious, she made her way toward the noise, only to freeze in horror at the doorway. There, standing in the dim light of the kitchen, was one of the wooden statues from the dining room. In its rigid hand was clutched a gleaming knife. Just like I saw it. I replied. Shay tried to help me rationalize things when nothing happened. Marielle, I think it just might have been your illness. Maybe that morning you still had a fever and didn't realize it. I must have looked unsure because Shay put her arm around me in a reassuring hug and said, "It does happen, you know." She smiled. "You're right, I'm just being foolish," I said. My parents would be coming to stay for a few days and I was thinking how very much I was looking forward to it. I had just got home from work and I was starving and I started down the hallway towards the kitchen and that is when I heard it. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. I could make out the sound of silverware on plates, low murmuring voices, and the chink of glasses. Someone was in the dining room and they were having a meal. My fear levels rose and I almost ran out, but I felt I wanted to see those things straight on, not just in weird circumstances that could be explained away. Relief flooded my whole being. Sitting near each other, sharing their meal was my parents. I was so grateful I could have cried. I entered the room, fully aware those things were present. "Hey, you, I didn't think you would get here until tomorrow." My dad laughed, reaching up to hug me. "It was your mother." My mom looked at me and smiled while rolling her eyes. "That's right," she said, "I was not going to miss getting a little extra time with my baby." I laughed when my dad looked at me and said, "Explain those," pointing with his fork at the statues. My parents were with me for a full week. Since nothing happened, my fears began to abate. I returned home one night after my parents' departure and heard someone talking in the apartment again. It seemed to be coming from the dining room. I hurried toward the dining room, relief washing over me. They were back. Somehow, their presence made it easier to be here, as if the weight of the apartment's suffocating emptiness lessened when others were around. I reached the doorway, expecting to see my parents seated at the table. Instead, I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice. They were there, not my parents. Them, the statues. Only they were no longer statues. The ghosts sat in the chairs, their transparent hands resting on the table, their hollow eyes locked onto mine. They looked very human. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. They sat around the dining table as if waiting for something. The thought passed through my fear-shocked brain that the last time they sat at this table together they had died. Richard Challam jumped to his ghostly feet. He put his hand out, palm raised toward me, in an offer for me to take it. Please, Marielle, please say you will join us. The others turned their heads to look at him as he spoke and then turned their heads toward me expectantly, awaiting my answer. I backed away slightly. He leaned forward, placing his hands down on the inlaid tabletop, his expression weary. I need you to stay with me, Marielle. One way or another you will stay. He seemed to be trying to keep his anger at my not accepting his hand under control, but for a brief moment, I saw it. He stood up fully and his face softened as he began to walk around the long dining table toward me. This action, for some reason, suddenly broke me out of whatever trance had me standing there in a stupor, and it caused me to instinctively turn and run. I sprinted to the entry hall, grabbed my keys, purse, and briefcase, and then sprinted through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I rushed to the elevator with my key ready. I quickly got on, relieved when the doors closed, knowing those things would not pursue me as they seemed to be tethered to the statues made in their likeness. When I reached the street, I could not keep myself from looking up at the living room balcony where I could see them, all four of them, lined up next to each other. They were looking directly down upon me in the street far below. The other three spirits turned and returned inside the penthouse. Richard stood there. I could not see his face from such a distance, but I knew he was silently trying to will me to return. Even from this distance I could feel him trying to exert his will upon my own. I turned away and rushed into the dense crowd on the sidewalk, disappearing into a sea of humanity. I never went back. I only had a few personal belongings in the penthouse, so I hired a couple of movers to gather my belongings. Something in the way Richard looked at me in the dining room told me that if I had ever entered that apartment again, he would find a way to make me one of them. I quit my job and left town for good a couple of weeks later.